morning, everybody. I consider it to be an honor and a privilege to be able to come here and speak to you about implicit bias in the judicial system. But before I get into the meat of what we're going to talk about, I think there's a little feedback there. Okay, is that a little better? Everybody can still hear me? All right. Before we get into the meat of what we're going to talk about, it occurred to me that the words implicit bias may not resonate with everyone because not everyone is perhaps familiar with what implicit bias actually is. So let me see a show of hands. Who has been to implicit bias training in this room? Okay, I know I might be fooled by my sensory perception given the last lecture, but it appears to me that that's about 25% of you. I don't have any trace paper, so I'm not going to trace you to find that out for sure. So raise your hand if you have never been to any kind of implicit bias training. Okay? Who just heard of implicit bias for the first time an hour ago? Has everybody heard of it at least? Okay. All right, and I'm just I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I really want to get an idea of who my audience is. I myself, as a judge, was required to go to implicit bias training. Every judge in the state of Iowa, in fact, every judicial branch employee in the state of Iowa is required to attend implicit bias training. And it's something that I would certainly recommend that you do some reading on. There were some articles and studies that were cited in the last lecture, but it's a very fascinating concept. And it's fascinating because when we talk about implicit bias, sometimes, at least, and I'm going based on my own experience, sometimes I notice that when you mention the words implicit bias together, some people start to cringe a little bit, right? And does anybody have any idea why the words implicit bias themselves would make somebody cringe? And don't be shy now. I know the lawyers in the room. Raise your hand if you're a lawyer. I know who you are, so don't be shy. All right. So most of you know me, and I've asked most of you harder questions in court. So, so why do you think that would make somebody cringe? All right. Okay, go ahead. That's absolutely right. There was a time, I think, in our society, and I think this is a testament to how societies evolve and change, that people were a little bit more comfortable with their ideas, and they maybe didn't even consider their ideas to be biases in a way, because bias has a negative connotation to it. When we talk about implicit bias, we become a little bit uncomfortable before we even start having the conversation. And I think that I want to encourage everyone to recognize that and understand that when we're talking about implicit bias, we're not trying to put labels that are negative or positive on implicit bias. We're simply describing how the brain works. And that's a very important thing to understand because it helps to advance the conversation. You can't have a conversation about something if you are going to be timid about talking about it. Who here has seen, either as a juror panelist or as a trial attorney, jury selection? Okay, a good number of you. Well, I can tell you, if you are going to pick a jury as an attorney, you have to ask questions that would make most people feel a little bit uncomfortable. And the reason why is because you want to make sure that the jury you end up with is a jury that can be fair and impartial and do their jobs the way they're supposed to do so that you can have a fair trial, right? So those of you who have seen jury selection, those of you who have participated as attorneys in jury selection or been asked, who's been on a jury panel? Just non-lawyers, right? Okay. So I bet most of you were asked some questions that you thought were a little bit difficult to answer, right? Especially in front of other people. I want to encourage you to ask the same kinds of questions when you're having discussions with your friends, having discussions with your family members, having discussions with your coworkers about implicit bias, because it's not about good or bad. It's about how we can analyze how our brains are working so that we can get to the result that we're all looking for. And when someone comes into court, I've done a number of jury trials as a judge and also as an attorney when I was an attorney. And I, now that I'm in my role as a judge, will always tell the people who are there that the goal of the justice system is to allow parties to have a fair and impartial hearing on the dispute that they have. And that is a part of our system that is so important. It can't be understated. If we are aware of something that could have a negative impact on attaining that goal, we can't consider it to be the pink polka dot elephant and just sit it in the corner. We have to address it. We have to talk about it. And so I encourage everybody, don't shy away from discussing implicit bias. So what is implicit bias? You heard a lot about it during the last lecture. And who can tell me in their own words what implicit bias actually is? If somebody walked up to you and said, I hear you just had some discussions about implicit bias. What is implicit bias? What does that even mean? So I'm not going to, somebody be courageous. Raise your hand and tell me in your own words. All right, go ahead.
It's where the lizard part of your brain makes judgments about people in the world without you really consciously thinking about it.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And that's exactly what it is. Implicit bias, as opposed to explicit bias, is you have an idea, and it can be about a person, it can be about a situation. It doesn't necessarily have to be about a person, but it can be. Your brain processes information, and I'm no expert on it. I'm not a neurologist or not a scientist, but I have had a chance to read some of the studies, and my understanding is your brain processes a lot of things on the unconscious level that you are not even aware of. And so, because all of those things are going on, you have to understand that your fears, your hopes, your emotional responses to situations and to people may not be conscious thoughts. They might be unconscious thoughts. And if you don't believe, I've got one more example. I know you were given many already, but who's afraid to fly in an airplane? Okay? There are a few people that are afraid to fly in an airplane. Now, you've heard all the statistics about who was afraid to drive their car here today? Anybody? Not a single, well, maybe one person, because you had to come down 380. All right. So, but my point is, everyone knows it's much safer to fly in an airplane than it is to drive a car. And we've seen studies to that effect. There have been graphs that have been placed on television programs saying, look how, likely it is you could be injured or killed in a car, and there's almost no chance of that happening in an airplane, but we're afraid to fly. And that's because I don't know this for sure, but I think one of the reasons could be that unconsciously your brain is thinking, what are you doing? You're up in the middle of the air. We can't be here. We got to get back on the ground, right? Even though intellectually you know that there's almost no danger to you based on statistics. And we saw the example last period where you're tracing a table that is exactly the same size as the other table, but when you look at it, your brain can't accept that. So I want to talk a little bit about what the judicial system actually is. And I love to say something like this every time I give a talk like this, because I know you're going to hear from a lot of speakers and you're going to get a lot of information thrown at you today. So I want to take a moment now to say this. If you forget everything else I tell you today, I want you to remember this. Number one, implicit bias is real. Number two, the reason why implicit bias, it's important to understand it and try to deal with it, is because fairness in our judicial system is something that we absolutely must have. We absolutely must have fairness in order for our judicial system to function the way it was intended. The way it was intended to function was that parties that have a dispute get to come into court and have their disputes settled in a peaceful and fair manner, no matter where you're from, no matter who you are, no matter what you look like, no matter whether you're male or female, young or old. Everyone is entitled to that level of fairness in our judicial system. It's an essential part of our culture and our history. And anytime we recognize that there is something that could negatively impact it, it is incumbent upon us, and by us, I don't mean us as judges or the judicial branch or even just the judicial employees. I mean us as citizens, to do something about it. Sometimes when you look at a system, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the judicial system, and sometimes when we talk about inequities in this system, people automatically become overwhelmed, because the idea of changing an entire system seems almost impossible. But I will simply tell you that as I look around this room, I recognize many faces, and I know many of you to be talented attorneys, and whoever you are, you have a role in our society. I don't know who, are there some folks in the academic world here, I assume, right, from the university and such, and various other professionals and such. But what I'm saying is, whatever your role in society, you have a responsibility as an individual to try to change those things which you think need to be changed to make our society better. And systems don't have any sort of, they don't have their own consciousness. Individuals have consciousness, and individuals can change systems, because if you change enough of the individuals in the system, then you have effectively changed the system. So it starts with each individual who understands that there's something that needs to be changed, and each individual who has the courage to examine themselves, to decide and make a conscious decision to make whatever they're contributing to better than it was before they joined it. So whether that's an organization in academia, whether that's a business, whether that is a law firm, a government organization, nonprofit, whatever you're a part of, do your part as an individual, and I guarantee you that you will see some change. It's not going to change overnight, but it will eventually change, because, as I said before, enough individuals change, the system changes. So, what is the judicial system? The lawyers that raised their hand, I assume, know this, but I would just want to go through a quick overview, and we'll look at this is kind of what I told you already. So how can it impact the judicial system? Why is it important to those involved, and what's being done about it? So there are a couple of different areas. There's the criminal area, which includes felonies, indictable misdemeanors, simple misdemeanors, and traffic ticket. I assume everybody's had a traffic ticket, right? No? Come on, you're talking to a judge. All right, a few people have had traffic. Nobody wants to admit it. Okay, that's fine. All right, so on the criminal side, how do we think implicit bias might impact the criminal side of things? Any ideas? What do you think? At sentencing is a possibility. What else?
Even who you choose to investigate.
Okay. All right. So it could have it. You're saying that the the investigation that brings the case to court may have people, I mean, the whole system has people involved, right? And since we, I think, all agree that implicit biases do impact people, that maybe those people doing the investigation before the case gets to criminal court. Okay? Any other ideas? Okay, discretionary judgment. All right. Other ideas? All right, go ahead. Okay, who gets charged in the seriousness of the charge? Yeah. Jury selection. That's a good one.
Plea bargaining.
Plea bargaining. Okay, all right. So, well, did you have another one that you were going to? Okay, all right. So basically, throughout the entire process, it could have an impact, right? So the idea is if you're a part of the process, you need to try to be aware of the fact that implicit biases exist and how they may be impacting your decision making at any particular point in time. So as I said before, every judicial branch employee was required to go through implicit bias training. Why do you think that we did that? Any ideas? Who thinks that, I don't want to keep picking on Liz. Let me ask you this. Who thinks that implicit biases might have an impact on the criminal justice system? Okay. So do you think that, why would we send all of the judicial branch employees, not just the judges, but the clerks, the court attendants, the court reporters, why would we do that? Why is that important? Why not just the judges, right?
You can't counter implicit bias unless you're aware of it.
Okay.
If people aren't tracking it and people aren't calling each other out on it,
right.
You're not going to have awareness of it.
Okay, right, yeah. And just to kind of piggyback on that, I think that's excellent. We just learned in the last lecture that how you perceive a situation, even though you think it is all up here in the conscious realm of what's going on up here, we realize that a lot of it is in the unconscious realm. Whether or not you hand somebody a warm cup of coffee or a cold drink can have an impact on how you describe that person. What do you think let's say that you're going to the courthouse, right? You have to go there for your case, and you have to go through security, okay? You have an interaction there with those folks. Then you go and you talk to the court attendant, and you may see some of the other clerk staff and such. And then by the time you get to the courtroom, do you think that how you were treated through that whole process might have an impact on what your demeanor or how you were feeling when you get into the courtroom and get to see the judge? Everybody agree that that's possibly important? That whole process is important, right? Because as the judge, if I'm sitting there and I'm interacting with someone, and I've been through the implicit bias training, all the judges have, but might it make a difference on how I perceive how serious somebody is taking this situation, if they're fully engaged, if they are trying to tell me how they're going to improve their lives, or if they come in there, they seem angry and distant and don't want to interact very much, won't give me any answers about whether they're trying to find work or trying to stay out of trouble. All that's going to be maybe impacted on their journey through the whole court process, right? Does everybody agree with that? Does everybody see how everyone can have an impact on this entire system, right? So we all went to the training. Does it just affect the criminal system, or what about civil litigation? Could it have an impact on civil litigation? I still haven't heard one that I'm looking for. Family law, probate, juvenile delinquency, or in child protection. But what is, I know some of you in here do family law. What is one of the biases that you think might show itself in the family law context? If you have a client that goes into family law, if there's a custody dispute with a child, anybody have any ideas about what sorts of biases exist in our society? What do you think?
That dads aren't going to do as good a job as moms.
Yeah, that's part of our culture, right? I mean, we don't want to admit that, and thank you for speaking up, but no one likes to say those kinds of things out loud because we know that we're supposed to treat everyone the same, but the reality is sometimes in our culture there are ideas that exist, and those ideas impact us on some level, whether we buy into them or not. For the unconscious biases, we don't buy into them. That's part of the definition of unconscious bias. But we can't ignore the fact that in our society there are certain ideas that exist, and we have to be aware of them if we're going to truly treat everyone in a fair manner. And I think that the second point I wanted to make about that is, does it matter perhaps who your attorney is? Okay, why? I heard someone earlier talk about their experiences as a female attorney and how they have been treated sometimes. I know I heard that somewhere in the room, right? I mean, let's talk about that for a little bit. What do you think might happen? Yeah.
So I think in business litigation is where I have that more often, is people expect you to kind of be a tougher business attorney if you're a man.
Right.
They don't take you as seriously in civil litigation if you're.
Right, yeah. So that can just impact, and when we think about the justice system, if you will, sometimes, like most people, I think, just think of, oh, 5 minutes, okay, all right. Most people, I think, just think about the fact that what happens when you get in the courtroom, you know, and what's the judge going to do? How am I going to present my case? How is this going to go? But I want to talk about civil litigation in the same way we talked about the criminal justice system. I want to suggest to you that it could have an impact on every stage of the process. Say one of your friends is looking for a business attorney, and they go talk to a man, and then they go talk to a woman. If they don't understand that whether the person is a man or a woman makes no difference with regard to their competence to handle the case, they might be predisposed to hire someone that ultimately won't handle their case as well. So the individual is who's going to make the difference in this battle to make our justice system fair and impartial, which is what the goal is of the justice system. So civil litigation, criminal litigation, it affects every area of the justice system, and that's why we were required to go to the training. I talked about this a little bit, but what's being done? We talked about the problems, and they exist. What's being done? We're doing training, and we're trying to raise awareness. And everyone who is concerned about this issue has a role to play. I would encourage each and every one of you to share what you've learned here today with your friends and your family, because this isn't just a problem. The justice system is not this abstract thing that exists for someone else. It exists for the betterment of society. And everyone in this room and all of your friends and family are a part of that society. And the more you can do to support raising awareness about implicit bias and trying to make sure it does not have a negative impact on the justice system, the better off the justice system will be. I'm going to leave you with a quote from the Iowa Supreme Court. Well, I want to talk about two things. So this is a proposed jury instruction. It's a portion of a proposed jury instruction from a federal judge who I didn't name because I didn't talk to him and ask him if I could quote him. So, but it says, and I'm just going to read it verbatim, because you are making a very important decisions in this case, I strongly encourage you to critically evaluate the evidence, resist any urge to reach a verdict influenced by stereotypes, generalizations, or implicit biases. So as you can see, this is a discussion that is taking place not only in your state court system here in Iowa, but at the federal level as well. We're recognizing it as an issue, and we're trying to deal with it as best we can. There's no magic formula to this, because it's hard even for the people who have studied this issue to fully understand exactly how it impacts us. But when we're aware of it, we can start to deal with it, and that's what we're trying to do. The last quote I'll give you is from our Iowa Supreme Court. This was one of the justices on the Iowa Supreme Court who is discussing implicit biases. So this quote was within a discussion. All the justices were discussing implicit biases and how it may or may not affect decisions that juries made. And the discussion was whether or not to include or to require implicit bias language in a jury instruction. But this is what this was said. Any verdict, judgment, or sentence motivated by any type of bias is unjust. Our system of justice must have confidence that the outcomes of trials were achieved with impartiality and fairness. And that was a quote that I just pulled down. I think it was made either in June or July of this year. So I think I've saved a minute for questions, or have I? All right. So does anybody want to ask me any questions?
As a judge, have you found it difficult to make rulings without bias when, for example, you know a criminal defendant has committed some violent crimes that are not really admissible as evidence? Do you have a difficulty with your own rulings to try to follow the rules of evidence and not make rulings that would be against that defendant because you know maybe they...
I understand. I understand your question. Could everybody hear the question? So the question essentially was, do I as a judge have a difficult time making fair decisions if I know that a criminal defendant has a violent history, even if that history is not admissible or not proper to consider with regard to the sentencing, right? And of course, that's a trick question because I just spent the last half hour telling you about how your unconscious mind has an impact on you and you don't even know it. So the answer is, I do the best I can as a human being to be fair in each and every case that comes before me. And my ability to do so has, I think, been enhanced by my awareness of the fact that everyone has unconscious biases. And what I try to do personally is to look at each and every situation and examine not only what my conclusion should be, but why I reached that conclusion. And if I am, and I think one of the real tests is if I take 4 or 5 files and set them next to each other, and same admissible facts on all of them, and if I am not coming up with the same conclusion for all of them, then it's time to go back to the drawing board and figure out why my reasoning isn't matching up. So there are things that you can do consciously, I think, to overcome these unconscious biases that exist. But it's not easy. But we all have to try to do it, I think, in order to make our justice system what we want it to be. So I think my time is up. So thank you very much for your time and attention. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.